Welcome, everybody, to Firehouse Talks with Jersey Rick, igniting leadership excellence. I'm Rick, and this is my co host, Emily.
Hello. So we're going to just jump right on in, right?
Yes, but before we jump right on in, Emily, I want to mention that our podcast is not just for firefighters. Even though it's called Firehouse Talks with Jersey Rick, Emily and I, we're talking about everything leadership. And if you've been following our podcast, this is episode number 16, and we've been doing this since February of 2024.
Yeah.
And you'll have known, yeah, Rick's not just talking to firefighters, and you will have heard me say that we've got people who are not firefighters that are listening to our podcast. So, with that being said, Emily, what are we talking about today?
Well, I just want to add in real quick, too. The reason why it's called Firehouse Talks is because when you were a battalion chief, you would go to the fire stations and sit down at each firehouse and
Correct.
talk to them at the kitchen table. So it's like we're all just having a conversation with everyone
Yes,
here,
absolutely.
our
Correct.
listeners.
hmm
So we'd like to thank you all for tuning in today. And we are asking the question, do you know your team and are you looking out for them?
And as we talk about the team, let's not forget that yesterday was September the 11th, the 23rd anniversary of the Islamic terrorist attacks on our nation, where they attacked the World Trade Center, crashed two aircraft into each of the towers, into the Pentagon, and then the foiled hijacking attempt that was derailed by brave citizens on board United Flight 93,
No.
and it crashed into the landscape in Pennsylvania. So the death toll from these Islamic terrorist attacks was 2,977 people, including 343 FDNY firefighters. Well, let's just remember, despite the politically correct rhetoric from the left and the socialist news media, let's make no bones about it. Our nation was attacked by Islamic terrorists. And for those who don't know, that's not the first attack on the World Trade Center. The first one occurred in 1993 when there was a bombing, and the intent was to bring the buildings down. However, that was not successful. So let's not forget 9/11.
Absolutely.
I don't. I know Emily doesn't.
No.
I know our family doesn't.
Yeah. So again, our subject today is, do you know your team and are you looking out for them?
Yes, that's the question. Now, this is specifically addressing those people who are team leaders, regardless of what team that you have. Your team might be a small business. Your team might be the watch for the local police department that comes on at a particular hour. You might be the charge nurse in the hospital, and that is your team. You might be the associate pastor of a church, and your team are a group of people who are teaching classes in the church. Team leaders is who we are specifically addressing today. And not just superficially knowing people, but going beyond that. And that's what we are going to be talking about today.
Yeah. So let's ask our listeners, do you know your team members?
Mhm.
And this goes like what you were saying, it goes beyond the question that's often asked, how are you doing? Or which evokes the response of fine or good.
Right. And what does my wife, your mom, say
I
fine
was just
stands
gonna say
for?
that. Yep. She says, yeah, we were never allowed to say fine in our household because it stands for feelings inside not expressed.
Right.
I would always catch
Yeah,
myself
yeah,
saying
right.
fine.
That very surfacey thing. And for the Christians out there who are listening, when questions they ask, how are you doing? Well, God is good. You know, oh, that is such
Yeah.
that's such a pat answer. It's like no fooling. Yeah. So what lies behind all this? Do you truly know your team?
Yeah.
Yeah, does it go beyond that question of how are you doing? Now, I was reading in John Maxwell's most recent book, High Road Leadership, about the president of High Point College in North Carolina, how he immigrated to the United States from Lebanon. His mother sent him here after his father died to get an education, and the guy didn't even know how to speak English. And he went from that to being the president of this college in North Carolina. And Maxwell described how, I wish I could remember his, I can't pronounce his name essentially, is how the president of the college makes sure that he spends time with people. He spends time with the faculty, he spends time with the students. He is taking the time to get to know the people on his team, the people who are working for him. And so, hey, folks, for those of you who say, I don't have time to get to know my people. Oh, if I had a yellow penalty flag, I'd throw that right now. Those of you who have followed this podcast have heard me say, well, Napoleon had time to visit his people in the field. Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of England during Second World War, had time to visit the troops. He had time to visit the dock workers. He had time to visit the factory workers. He had time to visit the coal miners. General George S. Patton Jr., commanding general of the Third Army during World War II, he had the time to get out in the field where the shooting was going on and visit the troops. Mad Dog Mattis, General James Mattis of the Marine Corps, had time to crawl out into the field in Afghanistan and spend time with the troops in the fighting hole. So, for those of you people out there who are team leaders, bosses, so forth and so on like that, say, I don't have time to do it. Yeah,
Make the
well,
time.
yeah, make the time because these examples that I just gave you, they made the time. What's their background? Family, hobbies. What are their interests? Their
Yeah.
strengths in their areas for growth. Get to know their strengths in their areas for growth. Notice I didn't say weaknesses. Our society has a tendency to say, well, we're going to strengthen your weaknesses.
Mm.
And I'd heard that for years and years and years until July of 2008 when I had the opportunity to attend a government leadership program. It's called the Rocky Mountain Program. And the first day of that program, the lady who was in charge of it says, we're not here to work on your weaknesses.
Hmm.
And I thought, huh, that's interesting. And she said, we're here to work on your strengths. And she gave a couple examples. And I got to thinking about, well, hey, you look at a baseball team and you've got players that are assigned to each of the positions out there. And you got somebody that's standing up on the mound, the pitcher. And out in the bullpen are a bunch of other pitchers. And they're all warming up. The guys in the bullpen are throwing the ball, they're warming up in there. And so the starting pitcher gets up and he starts throwing for his team. Now, when it's that guy's turn to come up to bat, typically, historically, pitchers are lousy at batting. Well, is the pitching coach concentrating on that guy's batting skills? No. That's what he goes. That guy is getting paid by the franchise to pitch baseballs and pitch baseballs well. And so that's what they're concentrating on because that is that person's strength.
Hmm.
So we spend so much time concentrating on our weaknesses and not our strengths. What I have found in my own personal life and then also in observations of other people is when strengths are built up, some of those weaknesses and those areas for growth, they start to follow along. I'm not saying that we blow off the weaknesses, but let's work on our strengths so we can help develop those other areas where we need to grow.
Let's dig a little deeper into strengths, areas for growth, and weaknesses.
Yes, what are your strengths? Have you ever given that any thought? You should sit down with a piece of paper and just think back as far as you can
Yeah.
to what you have always enjoyed doing and doing well. Yeah, those are strength areas. When I came out of the Marine Corps, I went through a career management program where we went all the way back as far as we could remember as individuals. And it was an exercise, it was a fantastic exercise. And some of these same exercises are in the book that's redone every year called What Color is Your Parachute? The company that I went through was called Bernard Haldane and Associates. And ultimately, as this got distilled down, those strengths became our success factors, which we were able to use in our resume because those particular success factors are with us throughout life. For example, one of mine is research. I've always loved research. Several years ago, my mom came up with research papers, book reports essentially, that I had written in grade school, and she sent them out here. Then, when I was at the National Fire Academy at the Executive Fire Officer Program, we had a research project attached to each class each year. It was related to that particular class, and also it had to be related to a problem in your department or community.
Yeah.
But that's one of my success factors is research. That is a strength. Do I have areas for growth? Yeah, absolutely. We all have areas for growth. And my co-host here, Emily, has helped out me in some of these areas. One of them has been patience. There's times that I could be an impatient individual. Is that correct, Emily?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I would
yeah,
say so.
yeah. And Emily's got a particular way to just say, Dad, yeah, like that. Now, now our weaknesses. Listen, in our last episode, I was referencing John Wooden, and Emily was referencing John Wooden, the UCLA basketball coach of the Bruins. Basketball is a weakness, folks. If you ever seen me, you'd say, "Yeah, you're right. You're right, David. You're about half the height of the average basketball player. That's a weakness." And so I don't run around and I don't concentrate on that weakness right
Yeah.
there. I'll tell you another weakness of mine is auto repair. I, I don't run around with the Chilton's manual trying to learn how to repair our car out there. That's a weakness, and no, that's one of those things that I'm not concentrating on.
There's just some weaknesses that you just have to acknowledge it's not in your skill set, and that's okay. You
Right.
don't have to be perfect at everything. And that's why there is a team because you
Mhm.
can delegate and you can be like, oh, like you're great at doing activities. Well, you do that. And then it's giving someone else purpose in
Yeah.
the team too.
Yeah, and I'll tell you another area here. So sometimes it's like, oh, gee whiz, you're short. There's times that has not been a benefit. Like when I've been a firefighter and I worked out at the crew level, and we had to pull the ceiling, with a pike pole, stick that up there in the ceiling, and that's it was a really long pike pole. I'd had difficulty. That was a task that really needed to fall to a taller guy. But then I remember a time when the very first fire department I belonged to was installing a deck gun. That's a bigger nozzle on top of the pumper. And they needed a short guy to crawl inside and sit on top of the pump with a pipe wrench and do some work. Well, guess what? That was
You were the
Ricky.
one.
Yeah, I was the one. That was Ricky Davis. So at that point in time, hey, I'll tell you what, I was really self-conscious about being a short guy, but I think that was probably my first lesson is
Mm.
being a short guy is not always a disadvantage. In
No.
that case, the taller guys, it was a disadvantage for them to be tall, but for me, it was an advantage being short because I was able to get in and accomplish a task. So now, Emily, I want to reference a book that I've read in the past called The Five Languages of Appreciation in the Workplace, co-authored by Gary Chapman and Paul White.
So, didn't you attend an event where Paul White was the speaker?
I did. I did here a couple months ago. I attended an event hosted by Kingdom Way Ministries here in Loveland, Colorado. Dan Anderson is the gentleman who runs that group, and 3 times a year he hosts an event called Common Pursuit. And so he brought in Paul White, and Paul White spoke to us about this. And he covered in his presentation, he covered those 5 areas that they were talking about in the book. Number one is words of affirmation. And this is a point that if you listen to a couple podcasts back, that came up
Yeah.
is where, one of the things that people want in life is, are you listening to them? And so, yes. And then those words of affirmation. Hey, you're doing a good job. And not just, oh, you rock. That is so generic. Come on, people. Can't you be more creative than you rock? I wrote about this in my book, The Furnace of Leadership Development. Be specific for the love of Mike. Tell them why you appreciate them.
Yeah.
Number two in their book is quality time. Yeah, again, hey, I've hit it already. Get rid of these excuses that you don't have time to spend, with your people. Acts of service. Now, what that means is when you see somebody on the team that is overloaded with work, where can you help them out? Can you find somebody else on the team who is capable to assist this person? Or, ooh, lo and behold, perhaps you can jump in and help that person get over that hump. Maybe you could pick up something else that can help that person lessen that burden that they have on them.
Yeah.
The fourth thing that they described is tangible gifts, whether that be somebody that likes coffee, you get them a gift card to a restaurant or so forth like that. I've taught with a gentleman named Brian Hines for a number of years now. His company is Chemical Safety Training. And there was one year we were out in Torrance, California at the ExxonMobil refinery. And of course, you had to go through security to get in there. And every morning it was a long line of people, contractors that needed to do work inside the refinery. And Brian and I would stand back there and we would watch how some of these guys were just absolutely nasty, nasty to the lady who was just trying to get them into the facility. And we saw that on Monday and we saw it again on Tuesday. And Brian and I on Wednesday stopped at Starbucks. And I can't remember her name, but Brian said, "Hey, why don't we get her a drink?" Yeah.
Oh.
I said, "Hey, yeah, that's a good idea." So Brian got her, one of them fancy Starbucks drinks, and it was our turn to come up in line. And Brian said, "Hey, you've been having a rough time with all these clowns. We wanted to give this to you." Man, I'll tell you what, Emily,
And it went a long
she
way.
lit up. It went a long way.
Yeah.
And on Thursday and Friday, when we were in line and some of those contractors were giving her a hard time, you know what she did? She said, "Go to the back of the line." And she looked at me and Brian and said, "Hey, come on up, Brian and Rick." Now, we weren't doing that so we could get caught up to the head of the line. But what that shows is, she appreciated the fact that somebody recognized that she was being essentially abused by these idiots that were out there. Now, the final thing that Chapman and White pointed out in their book, and for people in human resources in the legal department, you probably about nearly have a stroke over this one, but it's physical touch. Now, Paul White went into that one a little bit more in detail, and I encourage you get that book again. It's called The Five Languages of Appreciation in the Workplace, and you could see them go into more detail about this, but especially that last one, physical touch. You have to be very, very careful with that one. Now, listen, here's a word of caution. Do not assume that because you like words of affirmation that everybody else does. Do not assume that Bill likes acts of service and that everyone else does. We have to be careful. This comes back down to getting to know your team members. And also don't go down the path that people don't want to be recognized. People are human beings. They want to be recognized, but there's different ways to recognize people. Some people do not want to be called out in front of the group and presented an award. Those people might just be happy that you show up at their workspace and you tell them, "Hey, we really appreciate the job that you have been doing here for us. The program you're running, you're always on time. There's no complaints about it whatsoever. You're very efficient and proficient in your dealings with the public. Yeah, here, we want to recognize you." And then you give them something tangible. Whereas if you called them out in front of a whole group of people, that they probably would just about rather die.
I would be one of those.
So you have to, this comes down to, knowing your team and knowing how they function.
Absolutely. So, are you looking out for your team members?
Yes, yes. No, that could be a touchy one as well, depending on what position you're in the hierarchy of the
Yeah.
organization. Now, that doesn't mean you're covering up mistakes. You're not covering up their flaws, and you're certainly not covering up immoral, unethical, or illegal behavior. That's not looking out for your team members. That's mafioso type stuff. You know, hey, what are you doing not protecting Eddie? Part of the family. And there's a lot of people like that. It's like, oh, well, even within families, they want to deny illegal behavior,
Yeah.
unethical behavior because they're family.
Yeah.
And we can't go against family. Yeah. In fire and police, it's referred to as the thin blue line. There's a line that gets crossed, folks, when people are reinforcing bad behavior, they're reinforcing illegal behavior, they're reinforcing immoral behavior, they're reinforcing unethical behavior just because they're part of the group. We see this play out all the time in politics.
Absolutely.
Yeah, all the time. Or
The
there's,
elites.
yeah, the elites. We see this play out when somebody steps forward and they blow the whistle on an illegal activity in an organization. All of a sudden, that person who's had the courage to be the whistleblower, yeah, they become the target. So
Yeah.
I am not talking about that when I'm saying, are you looking out for your people? And it also doesn't mean that you give in to their every whim and desire. You know the types. You've seen them in the restaurants. Mom and dad who don't have a spine, who will not control their kids, who are screaming, running around the place, and they're attempting to bribe them by, now, if you're not good, if you don't sit here, if you don't quit running around this restaurant, you're not going to get any dessert. I'm not talking about those type of idiots, those cowards, who will not rein their kids in and make them set. That same thing happens in the workplace. You got some loudmouth whiner, and then the supervisor, I didn't say leader, the supervisor just gives in to them, gives in to them, gives in. That's nothing more than cowardice and people pleasing. What's the Bible say about that, Emily?
Yeah, so there's a verse in Proverbs 29:25 that states, "The fear of man brings a snare, but whoever trusts in the Lord shall be safe."
Absolutely. It's that lack of courage, the
Yeah.
fear of man. Well, what are they going to say?
Yeah.
What will they say about me? Oh, I'm going to let my crew member get away with that behavior because in the morning we're going to go fishing, and he or she might get mad at me, and we may not go fishing. They may not ever want to go fishing with me. Again, that that's not what leadership is about.
Yeah.
Leadership is having the courage to address these things. And when you get to know your team members and they know where you stand and you lay out expectations, your organization will have expectations. And then the individual team leader is going to have expectations as well. Hey, and they need to align, folks. Your expectations can't be off out into left field someplace, coming up with rules and regulations that go against what you know the mission statement is or what the organization has out there. They need to align, but it ties back in that each of us as leaders have different styles and different personalities, and they need to expect about how are you going to respond to these different things.
Yeah.
Now, you know, standing up for what is right and not allowing the hierarchy to bowl over people with unreasonable demands. Pardon me. A gentleman named Christopher Kalenda. He authored a book, or more the editor is probably a more accurate description of it, called The Art of Leadership. Kalenda was in the Army. He was an Army officer, West Point graduate, and it's a great book. I love that book, and he does have one chapter in there himself. Recently, he put a post up on LinkedIn and was talking about servant leadership
Mm.
and how that's abused.
Yeah.
And the example he was giving are the bosses who push servant leadership, but they're using it as a big club. well, we practice servant leadership here, so you need to stay at work until 9 o'clock tonight. I know your kid's got a baseball game on Saturday, but we practice servant leadership here. And so you need to be here all day on Saturday. No, that's not servant leadership.
Dictatorship.
That's dictatorship, and that's bullying, and that's manipulation.
Mm.
You know, that's what that stuff is. So yeah, I believe in servant leader, and the greatest servant leader that has ever been around is Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, that's an example of servant leadership, not somebody who's bullying and manipulating. If you're treating your team members by bullying and manipulating, that's not servant leadership. Yeah, and if you're threatening them by, you need to be here because we're servant leaders, no, that's not part of the team. Now, with all that being said, when you're standing up for your people, is there a possibility that you're going to get a target on your back? Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, there is. Because you may be working for some people that don't like pushback. They are the boss, and they expect you to toe the line. They expect you to shut up and just go along like some kind of whipped puppy dog. This is where courage has to come into play and standing up for what is right. And hey, folks, if you are not willing to stand up for what is right, if you are not willing to stand in the gap for your people, then you're in the wrong position. You know, and I've seen people like this, and I've seen them. I've seen one individual come in the battalion chief's office and complain about things that are going on in the fire department. This individual was on a different shift, and then in a meeting, he took a 180-degree different stance. Yeah, he was just kowtowing, and it's like, well, when he was in the office talking about it, he had some very good ideas, but he never said anything about the ideas. And then later on, he's complaining. I think, no, 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 no. That doesn't. And again, I'm not talking about insubordination. I am not talking about that. I am not endorsing insubordination. What I am talking about and what I am endorsing is the courage as a leader to step up and say, no, this is not right.
Yeah. And yeah, I mean, it takes so much courage, and you have to be willing to face whatever the consequences
Yeah.
could be. But is that worth the risk? Can you live with yourself at the end of the day if you're not going to step up, if you're not going to be courageous?
Right. Mm-hmm.
So, talking about that, how did you stand up for your people as a battalion chief?
That could be a long discussion there, but I'll succinctly put it is I let the people know that hey, this is who I am, and you're going to learn my style of leadership, and I'm going to get to know you. When I had committed to the fact that when I got promoted to battalion chief, I was going to spend time in the fire stations getting to know the people.
Yeah.
Yeah, they knew me as a company officer, but now I'm a shift commander, completely different role. And I had one man 2 years after I had been promoted to battalion chief. I was in his fire station. We were having coffee on a Friday night. And he said, frankly, I didn't know what we were going to get with you. He said, I knew what to expect from you as a lieutenant. He said, but I did not know what we were going to get from you as a battalion chief. And fortunately, what he got was not what he was expecting the worst. And fortunately, it was the other way around. But I had made that commitment that I was going to be out in the stations. I was going to have coffee with the troops. I was going to pass on information. I was going to get to know them. I was going to take the time to mentor them and teach them and train them in areas that weren't being offered, at the larger organizational level and the fire department. And with that, I told them that I expected them to be professional and ethical and efficient in their behavior. Prior to me getting promoted, my battalion chief's mantra was, it's your job to make me look good. And I had heard a fire chief say that too. It's your job to make me look good. Well, when I got promoted and I had that first meeting with everybody on the shift, I said, It is not your job to make me look good. That's called brown nosing and butt kissing. That's what that is. Your job is to do the best possible job that you can do in a professional manner, an efficient manner, and a competent manner, so we can get out here and we take care and mitigate the emergencies and we can all go home safe in the morning in one piece. I laid that out right there. And then I'll let them know, as long as their behavior and their actions were moral, ethical, and legal, I'd stand up for them. And if they made a decision that was outside of the norm and it fell into those categories and they could justify, if it was a questionable thing and they could justify why they did it, great. Yeah, I was going to support that. On the other hand, I let them know that if they did anything that was illegal, immoral, or unethical, I would support them from the standpoint of making sure that due process was served.
Yeah.
And I had a man on my shift 1 year who had committed domestic violence against his girlfriend.
Mm.
Now, there was no way I was going to support that guy and what he did. There's no way I was going to cover up what he did as well. Plus, I couldn't have covered up anyway because he had been arrested by the police.
Yeah.
And ultimately, that played out to where that individual was no longer part of the department. But I let him know in no uncertain terms that I was not going to support him other than the fact that I would do my job as a battalion chief, ensuring that due process was given to him from the standpoint of the fire department. Beyond that, the legal system, that was a different realm. So as a battalion chief, I was in that middle area between the operations chief and the fire chief at the top, and then the troops on the other end. The firefighters, the driver operators, which we called engineers, and the company officers, which were lieutenants and captains. And sometimes, had to take a stand for administration. Yes, this is what's going on, and this is correct. But I found out, Emily, is that when you took the time to explain to them an unpopular decision, they may not agree with it always, and they may not like it always, but they appreciated the fact that they were having it explained to them versus that's just the way it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think informed people are more happier people. I mean, I at
Yep.
least know, even if there's nothing with updates or something, I am more happier informed. I'm just happy to be informed even if there's not an update.
Yeah. Yeah. And on the other side of that is standing up for the troops when a decision has been made that was wrong
Mhm.
and that it has an impact to everybody, that not just one person, but everybody else. Is there a target? Yep, there is. And we have to make decisions as leaders as to what we are going to do.
Yeah.
So I think that pretty much wraps that up
I
there.
think so too. So is there anything else you'd like to add before we wrap up the episode?
Not with that, folks. We have been talking about teamwork and the leadership related to the team in these last couple of episodes. Last episode was, and we talked about the fact that it's not a mystery to
Yeah.
build a team. So, with all of that being said, listen, if you find our podcast, Firehouse Talks with Jersey Rick, to be useful, please like and subscribe and share. Let people know about this. It's free. There's nobody that's paying for this. Emily and I, we're taking our time. This is part of my business, the Fire Officer Leadership Academy. Say, Rick, why do you do this? Why? I'll tell you why. Luke 12, verse 48. To whom much is given, much is required. To whom more is given, even more is required. I have outlived my father by a good number of years. He died of a heart attack, and God has allowed me to go past that and to have relatively good health.
Yeah.
And I want to take my experiences and what I have learned through education and training and on the job in the fire department and the military, and I want to share that with others. And Emily and I, we get a great deal of satisfaction by doing it. So that's why we do this. Say, listen, visit my website, fireofficerleadershipacademy.com. The link is in the show notes. You'll learn more about the services I provide. You'll learn more about coaching. Watch the video at the beginning to find out exactly what a coach really does. Don't forget my weekly blog, It's on my website on Monday mornings, comes up at 7 a.m. Mountain Time. And then I post it on LinkedIn on Wednesday mornings. For the firefighters in the group, you probably heard me say this before. I'm going to repeat it again. If you're on Facebook, the Firefighters Leadership Network, I started that this year. I do post my blog up in there, and then I post other leadership information up there that I'm not generally putting anyplace else. And then I'm doing weekly videos as well, primarily targeting people who are not in the fire service, and I talk about the fire service. So, with all of that being said, thank you for tuning in today, and we will see you on the next episode. So long.
Bye.